Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Leela Srinivasan, CEO of Parity. Leela, what a pleasure to be connecting with you. I am so fascinated to hear more about Parity, but let me start by welcoming you to the show.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to share as well.
Wonderful, wonderful, because I know this is all very new in many cases. Well, let's begin at the beginning. What better place? Now, parity is just such a wonderful concept, not only for women athletes, but for brands. And I realize, as I said before, that you're a new CEO. You just started in May. A little bit about why you quite literally fell in love with the idea of parity.
Absolutely. Well, yes, you're catching me during my first 90 days, which is exciting. But I'm a marketer by trade. My career prior to Parity was I did some sales, did some management consulting. There was a business school stint in there as well. And then the last 13 years, I spent a variety of different tech marketing jobs. So LinkedIn, OpenTable, Lever, SurveyMonkey, and then most recently a payments company called Checkout. And as I'm sure this audience can appreciate, after my last three stints were all CMO, and after that succession of really high pressure roles, I was ready for a different kind of challenge, to be honest. And I find myself thinking about where could I apply this set of go-to-market experiences that I'd had in a way that would allow me to have lasting impact and to move the needle on something that I thought was really going to matter. And I just happened across Parity, and I have to credit a headhunter for that, of course. But for those who don't know Parity, just maybe I'll share a little bit about who we are. So our mission is to close the gender income and opportunity gap in professional sports. And we do that by basically developing high impact campaigns and collaborations between brands, women pro athletes, and then their fans as well. And the reason, I mean, if I need to explain it, I shall. I mean, the reason that's important is because the level of inequity that we see in sports is just staggering. It's really hard to get current, accurate data. But from the reading that I did on the way in, I think consensus is that women basically earn 1% or less of the global sports sponsorship market, which is just unbelievable. And when you look at the studies that have been done over time about media coverage of women's sports, even, about 5% or so of media coverage even today is spent on women's sports. And I think for me, having spent really a large portion of my corporate career in corporate marketing and broader business context, thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and fairness, when I heard these stats, I just realized that, there's no fairness in sports funding today. And that's despite the fact that I'm sure you're aware of, there is this surge all of a sudden. There is this increasing popularity, increasing momentum in women's sports. And for me, once I saw and heard and thought about that problem, I basically couldn't unsee it. And that's especially true for me. By way of background, I grew up in Scotland in a household that can only be described as sports mad. I feel like we watched every sport under the sun. Back in Scotland in the 70s and 80s, that meant for women's sports, it was Wimbledon once a year, and then it was Olympics every 4 years. So that was the extent of my exposure to women athletes. And, thankfully times are changing, but clearly there's just this extraordinary journey that we need to go on. And so once I learned of the challenge and the problem, and also looking at where Parity needed strength for the coming cycle, I find myself saying yes to Parity and also yes to my first CEO role as well.
Well, that's extraordinary on a number of levels. Number one, just to start with you, I have been tracking for a very long time how many CMOs turn into taking on CEO roles, because I also think that talks to the power of marketing itself as a role within the corporation. So congratulations, and we might have a different conversation about that. But now you said something very interesting. You said that one of the principles of parity is that you're connecting elite or women pro athletes, brands, and fans. And I think that that's a very interesting continuum. And of course, the statistic that you mentioned is just about unbelievable. that you say 1% or less of sports sponsorship money goes to women athletes. Now, I guess that we do hear about some of the bigger names, whether it's Rolex and tennis or some of the other major level events at golf or so on. But it's interesting. Let's begin. And I do, since you're a marketer, I'm very much excited to talking about brands. But let's start at the core and let's talk about some of the athletes that you represent. Because I understand they not only represent a variety of sports, but quite interestingly, they're quite multidimensional in their skills and interests and even their experience. So why don't you give us a quick snapshot of that and let's go on to a couple of other things.
Sure. And I think that's the beauty of sports. And something that sets Parity aside from other organizations in this space is our breadth. So today we work with over 850 pro women athletes competing in more than 70 sports. So it's everything from archery to weightlifting. And I like to think of that as being, if we have 850 athletes, we have 850 different stories waiting to be told in some ways. And I think there's definitely a lot of momentum in women's sports, more coverage, more discussion around the inequity. But as you start to get into that long tail of sports outside of the mainstream soccer, basketball, tennis, etc., those athletes need help. But imagine as you get into that long tail, it just becomes clearer and clearer that you've got phenomenally talented athletes. They're so inspiring, but they're often overlooked, and they are very much in need of support when it comes to monetizing their potential. And quite simply, the more money that they can earn through the types of opportunity that Parity can uncover for them, the more that frees them up to be excellent in their sport. One anecdote I'll share is we did a webinar recently with 3 or 4 different athletes just talking about their lives. And one was a track and field athlete who literally moved to Iowa, nothing against Iowa, but she moved to Iowa because that was where she could afford to live and train 6 hours a day and squeeze in part-time work around that and still be successful. But that training of 6 hours a day is what she needed and what many athletes need in order to really excel at their craft. So that's kind of just what athletes are going through, I guess, and why the platform's important. But then in terms of the diversity and breadth of the interests of the athletes, it is absolutely incredible. And one of the things that we do as we start to work with athletes at Parity is they go through a very detailed onboarding survey, if you will, with 60 or so questions to help us really understand their passions, their areas of interest, what they really would lean into topically. And this, the platform includes over 200 Olympians and Paralympians, lots of very accomplished athletes, but they're also incredibly diverse and multidimensional because many of them are mothers, they're small business owners, they're gamers, they're pet owners, maybe they care about mental health or sustainability, maybe it's financial literacy, inclusion. I mean, there are so many different aspects that might resonate with them. And then, of course, many of them are passionate about health and wellness, fitness, beauty, and so much more. And, like I said, they all have incredible stories about what they've accomplished on the court or on the field because they've had to fight hard to do that, especially if they're Paralympian or have other types of adversity thrown in their way. But what they do off the field, off the court, I think is often just as inspiring, if not more. And our job is to basically understand their stories, know everything we can about these athletes, and then be the matchmaker that connects those brands to the ideal match for them, for social media influence campaigns, for ambassadorship, to find the perfect keynote speaker that brings everybody in the room to tears. And we've literally seen that happen. And so, great intentionality in that matchmaking. And something that we're very proud of is our ability to help our brands land very, very compelling stories because of really understanding the athletes that we work with.
No, I think we both understand how important storytelling is to that, creating that emotional spark in marketing and creating some sense of differentiation for a brand. Well, let's run through a little bit more history, and then I'd like to get very much specifically into some of the brand issues. Now, Parity, if I understand it correctly, only launched in 2020. Can you just, which is not long ago. I mean, which makes it extraordinary that you have 850 athletes, but at the certainly shows a need. But could you just tell us what you've accomplished so far? Because from what I've seen, it is pretty staggering.
Of course, sure. So we recently published our first impact report, which the team was very excited about. That basically covers this first 2-3 year period. And in that time, we talked about the athlete statistics in terms of just the breadth of sports and the number of athletes. But we're also proud to have put $2 million into the pockets of professional women athletes. And a lot of that, of course, comes from our core bread and butter business of creating these high impact campaigns with brands and athletes, whether it's Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, Strava, but also smaller brands where there's that real connection into the athlete, skincare brands, nutrition bars, and so forth. There's also this other component where some of that 2 million is through us paying what we call athlete ambassadors who work part-time for Parity in a role like sales and marketing. And back to my earlier story around the triple jumper and her needs, it's about finding the flexibility to allow them to work and earn money while training. And one of my favorite stories of our athlete ambassadors is Dani Ararek. She's a 2-time Paralympian. She's actually competed in both summer and winter games, if you can believe that. And Dani started working for us as an athlete ambassador, working part-time in sales and, really kind of making sure she had room for that rigorous training schedule. And then ultimately, we were delighted that she was able to move into a full-time role when it made sense for her schedule. And I'm sure you can imagine that created quite a win-win, because it's no secret that when you are working with elite athletes, they're incredibly driven, incredibly hardworking. And, in our case, they have such valuable insight into the athlete community from their own experiences. So all in all, $2 million to date. There's so much more to do. So my hope is that this is really just the beginning of what we can accomplish and help our athletes earn.
Well, I hope so too, because $2 million does sound like a start. And let's hope we can see that double, triple, quadruple very quickly. You started mentioning a couple of brands that you're working with. I know you mentioned some are large, like Microsoft, and others are small, maybe in the personal care area. Could you just give us a little bit more examples, a few more examples of how athletes and brands really connect?
Yes, happily. So maybe we'll start with Microsoft. They are one of our favorites. They became our official technology partner and innovation partner of the Parity community, and they've been a key client for us over the last couple of years. And I think at the highest level, it's really about values alignment. They're very excited to support Parity's mission. They are just really, really thoughtful about what it means when a Microsoft partners with an entity like Parity. But working with Microsoft, we've worked together to create lots of ongoing campaigns which are centered around content amplification. And we've chosen topics that matter to Microsoft and its community. So things like mental health stigma, women who've changed the game. We're running a Game Changers campaign right now with them, in fact, and just the necessity and power of staying connected, which you can imagine for Microsoft's business is pretty fundamental. And I think to date, we've done over 130 pieces of content across 60 or more creators with a good chunk of impressions coming with that. So there's been a lot of content generated by virtue of the partnership and really focusing in on those core topics for Microsoft. The other thing I'll say about Microsoft is our chief partner and advocate over there shared that the employee engagement benefits of working with us have been really pretty important to Microsoft. And they run internal awareness campaigns against the work that they're doing with us in partnership with those Parity athletes. And that swell of positive feedback becomes really reinforcing. It inspires them to do more, it inspires their employees to lean in. So I think for larger companies in particular, there is that kind of that double whammy, if you will, that double benefit of the benefit out in the public in external marketing endeavors, but then also this internal benefit to your employees. So that's sort of at the Microsoft end of the scale, if you will. And I can share, an example of a smaller brand. So maybe one that is a prime example where there's that strong alignment again around vision and values is a brand that I think you know as well, Deb, called DNA Vibe. And this is a Colorado-based company that makes, it's hard to explain, but it's like light therapy technology. And basically that helps to accelerate recovery from injury. And, I guess the disclaimer is I'm currently using DNA Vibe or their jazz band technology because I have a knee injury, and it's been really great for that. So given what they do, of course, you can see the direct appeal of athletes as part of their story. And so we've paired them up with a whole range of athletes covering sports that range from like track and field to golf, basketball, bobsled, I think even. So it's a real, really kind of broad set of different types of sport. And then DNA Vibe was basically able to leverage the recovery journey of individual athletes in some very genuine and authentic storytelling as part of that, because obviously recovery is such an important part of an athlete's success, and every athlete is going to be different in terms of how that works. And so that relationships involved these athlete influencer campaigns, sponsored content, podcast appearances, testimonials, repurposing athlete content, in-person events is a big part of that as well. And anecdotally, we've seen the world around us really respond positively to in-person appearances and speaking. I think post-COVID, there's been that desire, I think, to bring folks back together. And yeah, we just love that partnership. I think the team over there is thrilled with having the opportunity to work with these athletes who, again, just have such tight alignment with what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that is, and I know Perry quite well, and he is an innovator in his own right. So he has the perfect product for, endorsement by athletes for sure, particularly those who do get the occasional injury. And I'm so delighted it's working well. But now let's take a step back. Microsoft was, the content and the storytelling made it a little bit more sophisticated in terms of making that connection. Just quickly, what would you say is the value of elite women athletes to a brand?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on this, Deb.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I think, especially as a marketer turned CMO. So, to my mind, it doesn't matter whether, and I had the privilege to market companies from Series A all the way through post public, and it didn't matter about the size of company. Brands, I think, are perennially looking to make a real emotional connection with the audience, and I think this is an area that athletes rather excel at. So I guess there are probably 4 or 5 ways that I think about the value that brands receive. So the first thing I'd think about is just the level of engagement that we tend to see when athletes take to their favorite social platforms, whether that's Instagram or TikTok or even, we're starting to see more usage of LinkedIn, for example. We'll see when Threads gets going. Jury's out on Twitter, of course, right now. But, many of our athletes, I guess, would be considered micro influencers because their followers are in the tens of thousands, not the millions and millions. But what we've seen from campaign results is that the quality of those followers is high. So it's a quality over like mass quantity situation. And I think the industry stats are that on average, micro influencers drive about 60% higher engagement rates than macro influencers. And it's easy to see why in the case of these athletes, because their fan base often has a very real connection to the athlete. That might be because they're really, really into the sport that the athlete excels in. Maybe they've met them at an event, they've seen them compete. And that really shows up in the engagement rates that we see. And when you think about the relative costs of engaging sometimes like a small army almost of micro influencers, it can be a very a cost-effective way to reach a broad spectrum of fans across many different sports. So I think that engagement is critical. And then, of course, if you compare what athletes can bring to your social media engagement relative to what brands can do directly, as you might expect, doesn't matter the industry, it could be financial services or food and beverage, health and beauty, but we've seen up to a 15x engagement rate basically versus brands issuing their own content. So, so I think, first and foremost, that level of engagement is one kind of vector of value. The second thing is, I think there's value in mitigating your risk as a brand by working with athletes who align with your values. So, it goes without saying that every time you engage with an outside influencer, you're basically putting your corporate reputation on the line by aligning with that athlete in this case. And, sad to say, based on things that we've all seen in the past, in this day and age, there is more risk to working with male athletes than there is with women athletes. There are simply fewer incidents, let's just say, whether it's around betting or abuse or firearms or anything else, right? So I think women athletes tend to be these incredible role models with far less controversy and far less risk to your brand. So that's a form of value that you could think about. The third thing I'd think about is just that there's value in the level of commitment that we see from the elite women athletes who are partnering with brands. And this is in part because, as we started by saying, we're here to try and close that gender income and opportunity gap, and there are simply fewer opportunities flowing through to these athletes. So as a result, our athletes tend to really lean in and care about the partnerships that they're part of. Frankly, they just, as I said, they just can't access as many other options. And so what we hear from our brand partners is that their male athletes sometimes will tend to just be checking boxes in terms of deliverables. They may not be as excited about doing the work, whereas women athletes are more likely to go above and beyond to make sure that the message that they're delivering is meaningful, that they really focus on the values of the brand that they're working with. The fourth thing I'd say in terms of value, and this comes back to the Microsoft example, right? There's real value in the message that you send to your employees by committing to diversifying your partnerships. And one example that comes to mind, we recently talked to a national healthcare brand that has spent literally millions of dollars on sports marketing, but whether intentionally or not to date, their focus has been solely on male athletes and sports teams. And it's pretty obvious here in July of 2023 that this is out of whack with the world, and there's tremendous value in starting to diversify your spokespeople and your partners. I mean, let's look at your client base, right? They're not likely to be all men. There's rising appreciation for and passion for women's sports. But, I think a lot of brand leaders right now are sort of, thinking, oops, I've really kind of over-rotated toward men's sports. And if that's the case, the only solace I can offer is that sadly you're not alone, but now is basically, the time to do something about it. And then I guess last, but perhaps most importantly, and this ties in with something you said earlier, Deb, just about the power of storytelling. For me as a marketer, I've always been thinking about storytelling, about how do you break new ground? How do you tell a different story that the world hasn't heard before? And I think there's just so much undiscovered talent in women's sports that will allow brands to create really unique content. And it's hard to put an exact value on that, but I do think that there's a goldmine of inspirational stories just waiting to be told. So whether you tell those through keynote speakers at events, in-person appearances, or just campaigns that allow the athlete to share their story, I just think there's a ton of value to be unlocked there as well.
Well, you have certainly covered a very wide range of specifics there, and you are obviously you're passionate yourself about this. I'm just curious. Let's segue for a minute to something a little bit larger, and that's the new world of fandom for women's sports. Why should brands care about these growing numbers? And maybe you could talk a little bit about where women's sports have come and what we should watch for this year. So let's talk about the bigger picture now.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say, it's exciting. There is this true momentum, I think, starting to build around women's sports. And we're seeing many more brands start to explore how they can get involved, how they can unlock the right partnerships. And with all due respect to brands, it's a little bit like watching like small kids play soccer, where everybody rushes to the ball or rushes to the shiny thing. And so no surprises, a lot of money, I think, goes first to the obvious places, to, soccer, the FIFA Women's World Cup, obviously happening this summer. And then you're seeing, you've seen the rise of a couple of celebrity-backed women soccer teams out of California. Very exciting, lots of headlines being generated, lots of brands leaning into that. And then basketball's another one where it's just such an exciting thing to watch, women's basketball. So you're seeing brands lean into that, very popular sport, of course. But it's a little bit of, as I said, that shiny object, flock to where the ball is sort of syndrome. And that means that actually sometimes there can be less value to unlock there because it does become more expensive quickly in those areas. And as we're seeing just from our breadth of the platform with Parity, there's this whole world of women's sports that's waiting to be discovered. And this whole generation of women athletes are ready to go to work for brand partners. And that could be in sports like women's rugby, for example. I can, talk your ear off about how that will grow in the next 8 to 10 years, or ice hockey, surfing. I mean, there's just so many different possibilities. And so, I think for brands, it can be a little bit bewildering, right? Because you instinctively know when you're starting to hear more about women's sports, you're seeing some of the headlines around brands making investments, and it's sometimes it's not always obvious to know where to begin. So that's the kind of area where actually Parity can help as well, because we live and breathe this space clearly, and we have done consulting work for household brands to basically help them think about where it would make sense to focus their investment based on what they're trying to accomplish, geographically or in terms of demographics and that sort of thing. So it's a lot. There's a lot happening. I would just, sort of encourage your listeners to think beyond the obvious and look at the possibilities so that you can really explore all the things that that sports has to offer.
No, you said that quite well. And if you wanted to tell people something that they should watch in the coming months, what would it be?
Oh goodness. Well, there's just such a lot going on. Sports wise, obviously the Women's World Cup is coming up. I think there's been a lot of talk around college sports as well, of course. So I mean, this was the year where we saw the NCAA Women's Basketball Championship exceed the men's competition in terms of viewers of the final game, and super exciting personalities and incredible play. So I think this is the level of play is really kind of on the up and up. And I think for me as a CEO in the space, there's just so much innovation going on in sport. And I think that's the piece that maybe isn't obvious if you're further away. So for example, even in the last 30 days or so, in basketball, because of this pay inequity and because frankly, WNBA players don't earn nearly as much as you would think, a couple of players have taken matters into their own hands, and they're starting an alternate league that basically happens in the off season of WNBA, so that players don't have to go overseas to earn a living. Brittany Griner was not in Russia for just for fun. She was there because she needed to play in the off season to make more money. And women players rightly are saying, I don't want to be away from home for months if I can avoid it. And so they're starting a new league in January called Unrivaled. So it'll be January to March, basically. And that's an example of the types of innovation. There's a new hockey league that's launching, which billionaire Mark Walter, who owns the Dodgers and Chelsea, has gone in with Billie Jean King Enterprises to create this brand new league. And there have been these two kind of rival factions in sports. So I think that will be exciting to watch how that comes together. Soccer is just on the up and up. The World Cup, I think, will be, an ongoing catalyst, along with these players starting to really kind of reach new heights. And then, of course, we are about, just over a year away from the Paris Olympics and the Paralympics. That might sound like a long way away, but the reality is that brands are already starting to think about how they should be drafting off that Olympic and Paralympic frenzy, if you will, because that's a once every 4 year opportunity with the Summer Games, of course. So, I mean, there are just lots of different ways that you can go. And then, of course, as I said, there's this long tail of other opportunities to look into, but lots to get excited about, I would say.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I love how you connect that with innovation in sport. And it's also innovation on the part of the athletes in many ways to come up with other opportunities, which is fascinating. When it seems that it is a time where there's so much movement going on all levels. Let me just ask you one quick question, because you did mention playing in other countries in the off season and so on. Just because we do have a global audience, I realize that quite a number of your athletes are based in North America, but I also understand that they attract global fans, and it sounds like they also perhaps play outside of the North American region, and whether it's in the off season and are well known. So there is a global element to that. Could you just clarify that a bit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think of sports as a global phenomenon, especially in a connected, always-on world, right? You think about social platforms and streaming platforms, and they've made it possible to follow athletes wherever they're playing in the world. But yes, you're right. We do have a lot of athletes that have strong international followings. In fact, with the World Cup, I found out this morning that we have multiple players playing for multiple countries, including the captains of Nigeria, New Zealand, Ireland, and Jamaica are all parity athletes, which is kind of cool, as well as, representation on teams like Australia, Canada, Norway, Italy, and so forth. So, I think there are a few reasons for that. One of which is the US is still kind of a mecca, so athletes do come to the US to play and to practice and everything else. So we see some of that happening. We also see athletes, to your point, going the other direction, so playing off seasons in other places. So I just think that, we just see different populations and different fans tapping into and following athletes from all over the world, which I think is wonderful. I mean, as an expat, as a Brit that moved over here 25 years ago to the States, I'm always thinking about that international angle. And so it's exciting today, but I think that's a huge area of opportunity for us in the coming years as well.
It clearly shows that you have a tremendous passion for not only sports, but for athletes and brands and marketing. And it's extraordinary what you've been able to absorb and do in such a short time. So, and I think that we could be talking about this for a very long time. So we opened by saying that you are new in this role, and you said that you're still within your first 100 days. Let's close by asking you what you hope to accomplish as a new CEO for this organization.
Well, I'll start where I began, which is coming back to Parity's mission, right? Which is to close the gender income and opportunity gap in professional sports. And in some ways, Deb, I think I was brought in to make sure that Parity was no longer the world's best kept secret, because I think we have a lot of opportunity to when it comes to building awareness. So, I'm here to help build a successful business, but our ultimate why is always going to be about putting more money in the pockets of women athletes, and because we frankly exist to serve them. So if we can do that, if we can accelerate the rate at which we're bringing brands, pro athletes, and fans together, it's a four-way win, basically. So athletes will be happy because they're earning more money, which means they can afford to spend more time training, they can be exceptional in their chosen sports. Brands will be happy to forge these really meaningful relationships with these inspiring and influential athletes. And that's going to be a path for them to expand their audience and their reach in very unique and interesting ways. Fans are going to be happy because they'll just get more exposure to the athletes that they care so deeply about. And again, back to that fact, they're so passionate about the athletes that they follow. So if we can make athletes happy, brands happy, and fans happy, that's how Parity is going to build a successful business. And so, that's really, how I'm thinking about the world. We have to serve those three different audiences in different ways. But there's so much potential here. There's a whole world of women's sports waiting to be unlocked by brands, and basically Parity's here to help with that.
Well, very well said. And I hope you'll come back in a very short time and let us know the kind of progress. And I'm really, really hoping that it will be by leaps and bounds, quite honestly. So you represent Parity well, and it's been a joy talking to you. And I think there'll be a lot of people who really understand your cause. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Deb. And I will say I'm also very approachable. So if anybody wants to reach out, you can reach me through LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk and share and see what we can do to help you on your journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leela. Talk to you soon. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.